I'd like to thank James McCormick Mitchell and his descendants. His name is on this lecture, and the descendants include his law firm, Phillips Lytle, represented here today. I'd also like to thank the ghosts of some legal giants, Buffalo legal giants, who are here with us, or at least connected to our presence this afternoon. They include, and I wish I had time to do justice and explain who each of these is, Thomas Penny, Henry Killeen, John Lord O'Brien, David Diamond, James McCormick Mitchell, Judge Charles S. Desmond, Manly Fleischman, Daniel Kennefek, Dean Francis Shea, Professor and then Dean Louis Jaffe, Justice Philip Halpern, General William J. Donovan, Philip Wixer, and many, many others. Now, I don't wish to date anybody, but for people of a certain age, I've just recited the starting lineup in the legal all-star, not just Buffalo or Western New York, but I think profession of its era, and their echo connects to the Jackson story and what we're doing here. And I add one more name, singling him out because a very special place on this roster, which I will discuss, belongs to Justice and later Judge Charles Brown Sears, whose actions across 3 decades made possible so much of what brings us together this afternoon. We commemorate here the second of Buffalo's, Robert H. Jackson, 3 major lectures across one huge decade in the history of this country and the world, which he delivered here at the University of Buffalo. The last of those 3 Jackson UB lectures, widely known, was his May 9, 1951 inaugural Mitchell Lecture. The first, the other bookend, on February 23, 1942, so coming up on an anniversary year, was then rookie Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson's speech here at the University of Buffalo, Youth Faces the New Order, which he delivered at the 42nd annual mid-year convocation, commencement, in the Edmund Hayes Hall, part of the University Center at the time. The deep and life-defining path of Buffalo began here. This is the county courthouse in Mayville, New York, located on the northern end of Chautauqua Lake. In this courthouse, young Jackson, a lawyer at age 21 in 1913, tried his first hundreds of cases. And by approximately 1916 or 17, in this courtroom, he appeared before a new New York State Supreme Court Justice who was riding circuit and presiding in this courtroom, Charles B. Sears, a name, of course, of this institution. Charles Sears couldn't remember a couple of decades later how much actual trial work Jackson had done before him versus how much conversation on the margins of the trials Jackson had with him. What stuck in his memory was conversations outside of court, where this young man impressed him as extremely deep, extremely talented, extremely interesting. And the milieu that made that possible was something like, frankly, the 19th century boarding houses where the justices of the John Marshall Court drank their port in Madeira and conferred after hours. The lawyers of Chautauqua County at the inns of Mayville, down the road from this courthouse, judges and lawyers had those kinds of interactions. Well, for Charles Sears, that man made a mark, although he was quite young. And what Sears did was recruited to Buffalo. Now this is Jackson on the left. It's a little bit of a grainy picture, but he's the slip of a person next to his wife and his widowed mother and his 12-year-old sister. And he was the support and the livelihood for those 3. Those were his dependents on which he petitioned and on which his draft board granted him an exemption from military service in the Great War, the World War that began in that spring of 1917. Jackson's world goes from this, which is fishing with Irene in the Broken Straw Creek, across the creek from the birthplace, and this, which is Irene sitting in his Jamestown office, a nice little cubbyhole desk, but obviously quite a modest operation, to this, the biggest office building on earth. Now, later, of course, Jackson headed the world's biggest law office, but at the time this building was built, it was the biggest office building on earth. It's the Elephant Square building. It's right downtown. It still stands in its majesty and glory. Because what Charles Sears did was told his friend Tom Penny, a great Buffalo lawyer, the Erie County District Attorney, the prosecutor of the assassin of President McKinley here in Buffalo in 1901, do I have the young trial lawyer for you? Penny headed a firm, Penny, Killeen, and Nye, office in this Ellicott Square building, which had a principal client, the International Railway Company, the streetcar company of Buffalo. And they offer Jackson a job, and he takes it. He goes to work, walking through this ornate lobby, taking the elevator up to the 8th floor. It's all still there, including the tile floor that he walked across many, many times. And I don't know if you ever remembered this, but when one walks through the Ellicott Square building today, knowing where the Jackson path went, this harmless 1917, 1918 geometric design does sort of jump out and cause one to pull out his camera. And Jackson and his young wife Irene, still no children, married just a year and a half, live here in Buffalo. This is Johnson Park on the west side in the historic district. This is the Lynn Haven building, built in 1901 as housing for the Pan American Exhibition, which of course attracted the president and then his assassin, and still standing today. It stands next to this white pillared building, which reputedly was the student home of Grover Cleveland when he was studying for the law in Buffalo in an earlier decade. It's a little pocket park. It's been cleaned up and rehabilitated, and behind the tree would be the building. You can see the doorway. You can see the pillars of the Cleveland home to the left. And that's the Lynn Haven directory, 49 Johnson Park, the Buffalo home of Bob and Irene Jackson during 1917 and 1918. About a 6-7 block walk to the Ellicott Square building, past the City Hall, past today the McKinley Monument, and so forth. That was his world. And he's trying cases at a furious pace in the state courts, in the federal courts, in the appellate division, writing briefs, appealing adverse jury verdicts in basic tort judgment cases against the Trolley Company. After 2 years in Buffalo, things aligned to bring Jackson back to Jamestown. One thing that's happened is that influenza is piling bodies on the curbs of Buffalo. That's the fall of 1918. Another thing that's happened is that Irene Jackson is now pregnant with her first child, William, born the next July. A third thing that's happened is that the Corporation Council of Jamestown, appointed by the Republican mayor, has been drafted to Washington for a federal appointment, creating a vacancy, causing the mayor to reach out to the best young lawyer he knows to pull him back from Buffalo. And a fourth thing that's happened is that young Jackson, having made lots of connections and developed early experience in Buffalo, has that but believes he can emerge quicker from the slight remove of Jamestown. And so for all of those reasons moves back there to establish his base in practice. And this is a photo that tangibly proves that he's right. This isn't Grover Cleveland's house. This is Bob Jackson's house in Jamestown, built a couple of years later with the proceeds of his successful practice. And then, of course, it leads to Nuremberg with the intervening events that I've talked about. While there, Jackson gets this cable, a little hard to read, but the last paragraph, this is Jackson's office in Washington cabling him in May of '46. Judge Sears, Buffalo, requests Justice Jackson as guest of Buffalo University, October 3 and 4, to receive honorary degree on occasion of 100th anniversary. Would like immediate confirmation of Jackson acceptance. And Jackson promptly cables back. Please notify Judge Sears of acceptance and appreciation of his offer, period. The date suggested immediately precedes the opening of full-term Supreme Court, which creates some possibility of interference. A nice, gentle phrase. I might stiff you, is what Jackson said. And would have to give court duty high priority, period. So far as I can see, however, I can be present. And then he's back in Nuremberg, and then the tribunal delays its announcement of its decision. And then he's leaving Nuremberg on the night of October 1 to be back in Washington on October 2, to get a night train on October 3, to be in Buffalo on October 4. He makes the trip. And for the rest of his life, what began in 1917 and continued across this period is embodied in the lecture, continues to be a central part of Jackson. His deep, close, continuing ties to Buffalo, to its lawyers, to its bar, to its bench, to its great university.